Hi, welcome back to IndyCar on the 12th of February. Now, when Donald Trump was originally elected as the president in 2016, and Boris Johnson amazingly became the became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I never thought at the time that we could fall any further down the rabbit hole than we already had. But I was wrong. And reading the news today, you could be forgiven for thinking that the entire world's gone completely bonkers. Because Donald Trump, in one of his latest addresses on his campaign trail, made a remarkable statement in which he was bemoaning the fact that many European countries were not paying enough into the NATO alliance. Now, the NATO alliance requires countries who are members to pay about 2% of their gross domestic product into, not America, but into actually supplying themselves with armaments and actually spending that amount of money on their military defence. And he claims that they're not doing this. Now, whether this is true or not is not really relevant to what happened next. Trump then went on to say that if some of those countries in Europe were not paying, then he actually encouraged the Russians to attack them. Now, this is remarkable, but not remarkable for Trump, because Trump is the kind of man who would lead an insurrection in his own country. Now he's actually saying that European nations should pay protection money to the United States in order for Donald Trump's United States to protect them from Russia. Now, this is plainly baloney. He has no idea what NATO is all about. The money that people pay in their countries towards defence doesn't go to NATO at all. It goes to their defence. It goes to spending on their armies, their navies and their air forces to protect themselves from external threats. But from Donald Trump's perspective, he sees this as some kind of transaction where the United States decides how much everybody should pay, and those who don't pay should be attacked by the Russians. Now, honestly, this is the man who is campaigning to become the President of the United States. And even more remarkably, a large number of Americans actually think this is the way things should be done. But this is just a symptom of the protectionism and the far-right extreme protectionism which Donald Trump actually espouses. And there are many such right-wing candidates and presidents around the world at the moment who think that countries should just protect themselves and leave everybody else to their own devices. And this is basically what Trump is saying, that America should just abandon anybody in Europe who doesn't pay the required amount and allow the Russians to simply attack them. And he has said quite plainly that America would not defend such countries if Russia invaded. To be honest with you, the whole of Twitter seems to be awash with this kind of nonsense. In fact, the American version of X, if you, let's say you entered a search for Ukraine, for example, all you would find is pro-Russian nutjobs espousing the fact that Ukraine is a part of Russia and it should just simply be allowed to be defeated, to be destroyed by the Russians. And the Ukrainians lose their identity, lose their homes, lose their lands, lose their families, and ultimately lose their lives. All because Donald Trump thinks that that makes America great again, and somehow or other this is a good thing. So Trump is a very, very dangerous man, particularly at the moment when he seems to have got a large number of Americans enthralled to this nonsense that America is somehow the protector of Europe and that the Europeans have to pay for the privilege of being protected in the first place. He also went on to say that no more funding should be given to Ukraine unless it were loans, and he would expect them to be paid back at what he claimed were very attractive rates of zero interest. But that if at any point the Ukrainians, having received this loan or these loans from the United States, were to turn against America or to in some way upset Donald Trump, that money should be paid back instantaneously. So Trump sees everything as though it was some kind of business, when in actual fact he's dealing with the lives and the families of millions of Europeans who he thinks should just be allowed to be subsumed into the Russian Empire, and he would do nothing about it unless they pay him. dangerous man indeed. But that's not the only rabbit hole nonsense that's been going on. Anybody who has read the National today will know that at Edinburgh Castle, the cafe has been reopened and named the REDCOAT Cafe. Now, historic Scotland, I'm not sure if they had much to do with this, but I assume that they had something to do with this, must believe that this is in some way a nod to Scotland's history. And the idea that a cafe should be named after the soldiery of an invading, aggressive state was somehow an acceptable piece of historical fact, and that it was perfectly okay for the people of Edinburgh and the people of Scotland to have a cafe named after the invading soldiery. However, it's caused a great deal of offence, and I have already included on my timeline a repost in fact, of a petition which is being signed at the moment as we speak. I think the last time I looked there were over 1,000 signatures, and it had only just really gone live this morning. So please sign it if you don't like the idea of a cafe at Edinburgh's capital city being named the REDCOAT Cafe. Frankly, I think it's the most insensitive thing I've ever heard, and given Scotland's history of being subsumed into the Union, I would suggest that they change their minds, because this is giving tourists in particular the impression that the Scots in Edinburgh welcome the Redcoats into their midst and gleefully accept the idea of Redcoat cafes as being part of our history. It isn't a part of our history, and it's not something that we would like cafes named after. It would be like, you know, having a Culloden cafe or something like that, or an Edward I cafe somewhere in Scotland. That is not going to fly. That is not going to be popular with anybody. Even people who don't particularly want to vote for independence would find that difficult to stomach. So I'd hope that as many of you as possible will sign this petition and get this ridiculous decision reversed, and perhaps change the name of the cafe into something a little more appropriate than the REDCOAT Cafe. Finally, I made a play of words earlier on in the blurb to this programme about the Duke of Edinburgh not getting steaming in Portsmouth. Now, of course, I'm referring to the sister ship of the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, which was meant to be leading the charge into a massive NATO exercise at sea. Unfortunately, the Queen Elizabeth had a problem with one of its propeller shafts and was unable to make it. And so the Duke of Edinburgh, the sister or brother ship to this one, which is supposedly identical in almost every respect, was meant to be leaving port today to lead the charge, to be the flagship of the United Kingdom's ever-diminishing fleet. But unfortunately, it couldn't manage either due to some other defect in its design, some other mechanical problem that prevented it from leaving port. Now, as far as I'm concerned, having aircraft carriers to defend an island, on the face of it, might seem a useful thing if you were being attacked by, say, another air force, or that you wanted to project that force of yours, your air force, to some foreign battlefield, for example, some other country in the Middle East, just for talking's sake. But unfortunately, the United Kingdom's aircraft carriers, although there are two of them and they're absolutely massive and they cost over £2 billion each, have between them something like 35 airplanes. That's not a lot. And despite the fact that these 35 airplanes are the most expensive American fighter jets ever developed, in fact, the most expensive fighter jets anywhere ever developed, it just seems incapable that the aircraft carrier which is meant to carry them can't go to sea, and neither can its sister ship because of design flaws in both of them. It's not a good look either for British engineering or for the British Navy, which seems to have a lot of admirals and not many ships. Somebody said to me on Facebook the other day, when I was pointing out the fact that these aircraft carriers have broken down, and in fact many of Britain's newest ships were unable to sail at all, that if we became independent we would have to defend over 70% of the territorial waters around these islands if we were independent. And then someone else pointed out that you don't need aircraft carriers to do that, and of course that's true, you don't. What you do need is probably some warships, surface vessels, submarines and so on, but you certainly don't need nuclear weapons. But you do need ships which are capable of defending against aerial threats such as missiles. You'll notice that in the Russian war in Ukraine, that the Russians are very rarely using airplanes to attack Ukraine. They're mostly launching missiles from a long way away. Of course, this is a far less risky proposition for the Russians, who've amassed thousands of missiles, both intercontinental and tactical and short range, surface to surface, surface to air, seaborne, airborne, you name it, they've got it. But it's all missiles, and they're all fired from a long distance away. So an aircraft carrier would be worse than useless. In fact, if anything, the aircraft carrier would be a missile magnet. It would be a tempting target, and having two of them, and they're being so massive, if there were an attack by the Russians, probably the first thing they would do is sink those two massive floating islands. Be pretty easy to do as well, as they don't seem to have that much in the way of missile defence. Although they have great big radars on the top, and I'm sure they do have missile systems on board. Could they cope with a drone swarm, for example? Probably not. So, is it right for Scotland to allow the United Kingdom to protect us with ships that don't work, with airplanes that can't fly off the ships, and with so few airplanes that there is a limit to how much they could even accomplish? It seems the British defence posture is to basically tag along on the coattails of whatever American military adventure is going on at the time, including things like sending their ships to the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, to do stuff down there near to Israel, near to Syria and so on. But whenever you see these aircraft carriers, either American or British, or naval adventures of any sort, it's nearly always to a country which is not capable of defending itself against the might of the mighty United States military and the tiny puny might of the United Kingdom's Navy. So is it really a worthwhile thing to spend all that money on ships that can't sail, aren't any use for defending the country in the first place, and basically just make us look a laughingstock? Well, probably not. But here in Scotland, there is no really great news, other than the fact that our sporting teams of various sorts are pretty successful. But unfortunately, the BBC has already said that Scotland's very successful curling team is not going to now be televised because of something else, and probably the something else is English Premiership football, which seems to be forced upon us at every cut and turn. Unfortunately, they miss out on some of the big occasions, such as Partick Thistle's recent match against Rangers. Now I'm talking about Partick Thistle women's team versus Rangers women's team. And for the first time, Partick Thistle held Rangers to a goalless draw, even scored a goal which was promptly disallowed for some non-existing foul, which everybody questioned. But it just goes to show you that great sporting events in Scotland's calendar are missed on a regular basis because the BBC just doesn't like to cover them, or if it does cover them, it covers them in some weird way in Gaelic and puts them on some side channel where you can't really see them. Here we are in Scotland, as usual, being kept in the dark, protected by idiots with ships that don't work, and pandering to idiots like Donald Trump, who is more likely to cause more wars and more strife and allow most of Europe to be overridden by the Russians if he gets into power. These are dangerous times indeed. I just hope that if Joe Biden is too old to continue to run as president, they find somebody else from the Democratic Party who can take his place, because if Donald Trump becomes president for a second term, the whole world is in a much less stable and a far more dangerous state than it is at the moment. And it's in a pretty dangerous state anyway as we speak. So as far as Scotland is concerned, well, we have a general election coming up where the game of musical chairs that is English politics will probably result in Keir Starmer becoming the new Prime Minister, and a very washed out and blue-coloured Labour Party will take charge at Westminster and do precisely the same things that the Tories are now doing, and will not reverse any of it, so we'll see no change. The only change we could effect would be to vote for independence in a way which mattered, and in a way in which the parties that we're voting for declare that if we vote in majority in any election for the Party of Independence, then that counts as a vote for independence. even then there would be an argument, and even then we would still need to go to foreign arbiters to actually have it adjudicated as being a vote for independence, and if it wasn't, to hold a proper referendum which would be organised by external international bodies so that we can have a proper vote which is legal and lawful and free and fair and is not subject to the whims of the British press. Either way, the world is in a mess, and I think Scotland is in a unique position to do something about this, at least in our own corner of the world, and by rejecting things like nuclear weapons, by rejecting things like British rule in Scotland, and certainly by rejecting ideas like a turncoat cafe, we can make our feelings known. But certainly Redcoat Cafe is not a flyer. That needs to go, and I think there needs to be a massive boycott or a massive demonstration directly outside such a cafe. It's not the fault of the people who work in the cafe, but it's certainly the fault of the people who own it and decided to call it a Redcoat Cafe. Surely it could have been called the Saltire Cafe or something like that. Anything but Redcoat. Anyway, that's it from me today. I'll hopefully see you again later in the week. Sorry, the programmes are still a little bit sporadic. Workload today and for most of the rest of the week is fairly cramped, so I will be broadcasting at different times. Remember that you can rewind this video even as I'm talking at the moment. You can pause and rewind it. You can comment. And of course you can leave messages live online at the same time. I've included the link in the description for the donations if you still want to make them, and I do still rely on them. So thank you for continuing to support the channel as it goes along. Hopefully I'll have some better news for you. I scanned every news feed today for anything positive about Scotland, and it was so hard to find anything at all that I gave up eventually. It was all murders, fires, road accidents, you name it. It was just nothing but bad news, and frankly I think we've all had enough of bad news. But we can all have a laugh at the fact that Britain's Navy can't even get out of port for an exercise, far less defend us against anybody offering any kind of threat. But it's a sad state when the whole of the United Kingdom has come to this, where the country is bankrupt, it can't afford its own defence properly, and maybe Donald Trump will cast us adrift as well if Britain doesn't spend enough on its defence. But who knows? It all depends on whether that idiot Trump gets into office. I hope not. Anyway, that's it for me today. I'll see you all later in the week. In the meantime, keep the faith, and remember that eventually we will escape from this madness. Bye bye for now.